astronomers, welcome back to science. Today, we're going to learn something a little different, okay? So, last lesson, we talked about the moon. What are some things we learned about the moon? So, we know that the moon actually rotates around the Earth just like the sun rotates around this, or I messed that all up, guys. The moon rotates around the Earth just like the Earth rotates around the sun. So, how long does it take our moon to rotate around the Earth? A month. And during that month, they go through something called phases. So, do you remember what the names of those phases were? Remember when it's a big, huge circle? It's a full moon. When it looks like it's been cut down in half, it's a half moon. When it looks like a little sliver, it's a crescent moon. And when you can't see it at all, there's a new moon. All right, so today's read aloud is called History of Space Exploration and Astronauts. What do you think this is going to be about? What do you think space exploration might mean? How might people explore space? Do you know what an astronaut is? So an astronaut is someone who's trained to travel into space. How do you think space travel began? Do you think it began? What do you think it was like for the first astronauts? Okay, so today I want you to listen carefully to see if any of the answers that you may have given me just now are right. Okay, so let's see what history of space exploration and astronauts might be about. So you know what we have to do first, though? We have to go through our vocabulary words. So let's see. Oops. Astronaut, a person that is trained to travel in space. An astronaut has to train for many years before he or she travels in space. Take a look at that. That's pretty awesome. Not gonna lie. Launch, to lift or push an object with force. In the afternoon, they plan to launch the rocket into the air. Rockets, engines that power spacecraft, driving them through the air or space. Straight up into the air. So these, see these right here? These are actually rockets. A spacecraft is a vehicle for traveling beyond Earth's atmosphere. A spacecraft has many strong layers to protect the astronauts. Technology, the practical use of new scientific discoveries. It was not until about 100 years ago that scientists made advances in rocket technology. So all this is fairly new. All right, so let's get started, guys. All right, let's see if any of our thoughts on what space exploration and astronauts might be are right. Ever since they first gazed up at the stars, people have always wondered if it was possible and what it would be like to travel outer space. For most of human history, the idea of traveling into space was considered to be impossible. Space, most thought, was out of reach, and there was no way humans would ever be able to get there. Still, this did not keep people from using their imaginations and coming up with creative ideas for space travel. The Chinese invented the first rockets. So remember, rockets are powerful spacecraft, or the power that spacecraft to drive them through the air. I can't talk today, guys. Hundreds of years ago, using gunpowder, the same type of explosive used to fire guns and cannons. Lighting the gunpowder would launch the rocket, make it go up in the air, into the air. It was not until about 100 years ago that scientists started to make serious advances in rocket technology. So they started out using something tiny like this, and look what they've come to. But you know what? Even now, our rockets don't even look anything like that. They're much more advanced. So a lot has happened. And let me think here. If you use gunpowder to launch a rocket, what do you think might happen? Seems to me like it might explode. It's a good thing we don't use gunpowder anymore, huh? By the 1950s, about the time your grandparents were probably born, rocket technology had improved to the point that people began to think seriously about space travel and exploration. Then there was a nation called the Soviet Union, which no longer exists today, but which consisted of Russia and other countries near Russia. So let's get our globe for a minute. Stop sharing for a second. All right. Let's see where Russia is. So here is Russia. Okay, this whole big place is Russia. So the Soviet Union would be considered this area back then. So here's Russia. Now, if we go this way, here's North America. Here's where we live. Remember, we're right down here. And over here is Russia, the big green area. So Russia's not too far because here's Alaska. Alaska's part of the United States, and here is part of Russia. So not too far. All right, get back to our, here we go. All right. Where was I? At the time, the United States was the only other nation in the world as large or as strong as the Soviet Union. The leaders of the Soviet Union and the United States each wanted to show the world that theirs was the more powerful country by being the first to launch a rocket into outer space. So this says, man enters space. So close yet so far, size Cape. US had hoped for own launch. Soviet officer orbits globe in 5-ton ship. Maximum height reached, reported as 188 miles. That's pretty crazy, huh? This was back, let's see, this was back in Huntsville, Alabama on Wednesday, April 12th, 1961. Guys, my mom was born in 1962, so that was a long time ago. This photo shows scientists in the United States launching the first rocket from Cape Canaveral, Florida in 1950. This was just a test to see whether this type of rocket engine would work. This was the first of hundreds of rockets to be launched from Cape Canaveral. And Cape Canaveral is in Florida, and they still launch rockets from there. The Soviet Union succeeded in putting the first man-made object in orbit on October 4th, 1957, by launching a satellite called Sputnik 1. A satellite is any object that moves in a constant orbit around another object in space. So some satellites teach us about space by taking photos. Sputnik 1 was carried into space aboard a rocket and then released. It didn't have an engine like a rocket, so it couldn't get into space by itself. It orbited the Earth for several months before re-entering the atmosphere and burning up. So remember, what happens to meteors that hit the Earth's atmosphere? They burn up too. After the success of Sputnik 1, the space race between the United States and the Soviet Union had begun. So it wasn't a real race with a start and finish line, but both countries wanted to be the first ones to go into space. So they called it the space race. Each country wanted to prove that it had a better space program than the other country. For several years, the Soviet Union continued to lead in the space race. The leaders and people of each country took the space race very seriously. It was not a game, but a true matter of national pride. So that means that feeling good for your country. The United States developed a space program called the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA for short. The scientists at NASA hurried to try to catch up to the progress the Soviets had made. A few months after the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1, NASA scientists in the United States launched a satellite of their own, Explorer 1. And you'll see here, this is the rocket that holds Satellite 1 going into space. It's launching. The space race continued at a heated pace into 1961. So both countries were trying very, very hard for 11 years to get into space. It's a long time to try to do something. When Soviet Yuri Gagarin became the first person to go into space. Oh, sorry, didn't mean to do that. Not yet. And returned safely. This picture of Gagarin was taken on the way to the launch pad for his historic journey. You can bet that he was feeling very nervous at that point. Why do you think he might be nervous? He's the first person to ever go to space. I'd be a little nervous too. He doesn't know what he's going to see or what's going to happen. The Americans were close behind. A couple of months after Gagarin made his famous flight, a man named Alan Shepard became the first American to travel into space. This picture was taken shortly before Shepard boarded the Freedom 7 spacecraft. Remember, that's what we used to travel into space. Notice that, like Gagarin, Shepard was wearing a helmet and a spacesuit. Space travelers need special gear like this in order to survive the extreme conditions of outer space, where there's no air and where the temperature can both be incredibly hot and incredibly cold. So the reason they have to wear those special suits is so they can breathe, because in their suits, there's oxygen and air being flown or pumped into their suit so they can breathe. Because once they get into space, there's no oxygen for them to breathe. It also keeps their body at the right temperature. We don't want them to get too hot or too cold. Returning from outer space is just as dangerous as launching into outer space, because you crash into the atmosphere on the way back like a meteor does. This photo shows the Freedom 7, Alan Shepard ship, after its flight. Shepard had the little capsule. So that little tiny piece right here is called a capsule. It's the small space where he's at. And you can kind of see this right here. It's kind of a window. He's inside there. Okay. Now think, let me go back. Here's the rocket, right? It's not the rocket he was launched in off of, but the capsule is about this right here. So all of this is not what he was in. See? When his flight was finished, the capsule re-entered the atmosphere and a parachute opened to lower it gently to Earth. Shepard landed in the ocean as planned, and the capsule floated there until a helicopter came to recover him. So you can see our helicopter here is a Marine Corps helicopter. See, there's the capsule. See how big it is? Space travelers like Alan Shepard are called astronauts. The word astronaut comes from two Greek words, astro, meaning star, and naut, meaning sail. So an astronaut is a star sailor. So it's also a person who is trained to travel into space. They have to train for a long time. Although being an astronaut can certainly be one of the most interesting jobs in the world, it is by no means an easy job. Astronauts spend years in training to prepare for journeys into outer space. Astronauts must be healthy and strong because space travel can be very difficult. Astronauts are stuffed into tiny spaces and launched into space in a rocket powered by thousands of gallons of powerful fuel. It is scary and it's uncomfortable, but astronauts put up with it. This picture shows astronauts undergoing training. These Apollo 17 astronauts are learning to use equipment for their mission. Early NASA astronauts also spend hours and hours running in place on treadmills, soaking their feet in ice water, and undergoing a number of other difficult, painful tests intended to make them tough. They had to be tough to be astronauts. So, friends, would you want to be an astronaut? I don't know if I have what it takes. I don't like being cold. Putting my feet in ice water doesn't sound very comfortable. And running for a long time on a treadmill, that sounds kind of bad too. Doesn't sound very fun. All right, so let's talk about what we read today and what we heard. And let's see if your predictions were correct. When rockets launch, we usually say blast off. In the read aloud today, we heard that the Chinese invented rockets. How did the Chinese launch these first rockets? They used gunpowder. Does the saying blast off make sense since they use gunpowder? Yeah, because when it blasts off, it explodes, just like gunpowder would explode. In the 1950s, the Soviet Union and the United States competed to see who would go into space first. What did we call this competition? The space race. Remember, wasn't really a race that you run. It was a race to see who could get there first. The Soviet Union was the first country to send an object into space, the satellite Sputnik 1. How did they get it into space? They launched a rocket that was carrying it. The United States wanted to catch up to the Soviet Union, so they started the NASA program and launched a satellite into space too. Then both countries launched something else, even more important, into space. What did they send next? People, or an astronaut. We had Yuri and Alan Shepard and Yuri Gagarin. I can't say his name. What is an astronaut? It's a person who travels in space. Okay, so you heard that being one of the first astronauts was not an easy job. What were some of the challenges astronauts faced? Difficult training. They had to run on a treadmill for a long time. They had ice water tests. Space travel was unknown and risky. Do you think you have what it takes to become an astronaut? I'm going to go ahead and be honest, guys. I don't think I have what it takes. I don't know if I would like being launched in a rocket up into space. It's kind of scary to me. But you guys might want to be an astronaut one day. And if you do, you better come and say, Miss Wright, guess what? I'm an astronaut. I would love to see that. My son, my 8-year-old son, he is fascinated with space and he loves space stuff. So maybe one day he'll be an astronaut. You never know. But in order to become an astronaut, you also have to do what? Your schoolwork. So go into Google Classroom, pull up your questions, and go answer and see what you remember about the history of space exploration and astronauts. And my little astronauts, I will see you on our next lesson. Bye, friends.